I'm Hanh Cao Yu, the editor-in-chief of Special Issues of the Foundation Review, and delighted to have you with us today. This is the kickoff event for a year-long celebration of the Foundation Review's 15th anniversary, and this is our inaugural author roundtable. I would argue that the Foundation Review is as relevant today as it is when it started 15 years ago, because it's the first peer-reviewed journal that's written by and for foundations, for foundation boards, and those who are in philanthropy. Along with you all describing the good that philanthropy has done, there's been a lot of critique of philanthropy, the origins of wealth, how it was created by the kind of wealth that could be extractive of labor and land. There's a critique also of warehousing wealth and the need to decolonize wealth, and that there's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few, and the need for more community voice in the decision making. Probably the theme that I've seen in many of your articles is the failure to bring a systems complexity lens to the work. There's too often a fixation on short-term solutions or quick fixes that are short-term oriented and not long-term to get at root causes of dysfunctionalities in the system, especially around racial and other kinds of inequality. Foundations too often, as they try to be strategic, downplay assumptions about how change happens, and they ignore the dynamic context and spend too much time not learning from implementation. Increasingly, the Foundation Review authors are speaking to this. I'm delighted today to welcome our panelists for the first author roundtable. Joining us today are Jane Way-Skillen of the University of Berkeley Haas School of Business, Geraldine Coffey of JD Partnerships, Julia Lin of Policy Solve, Rusty Stahl of Fund the People, Sam Marks from JFC, a foundation of philanthropic funds, Amy Saled of Community Wealth Partners, Brendan Euchre of Western Michigan University, Marilyn Darling of the Merchant Learning Community Project, Michael Quinn Patton of Utilization Focus Evaluation, and my co-moderator, Tom Kelly. I'll hand it over to Tom now to kick us off.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really appreciating the range of articles that you all represent, and want to ask all of you to think not only of each other's articles, but across the sector. What are the articles or topics that you want to be reading more about within philanthropy? What are the questions maybe that are still left unanswered or need to be explored further? And want to hear from you about the kinds of things that certainly would interest you, but would interest others in the sector.
I would like to see the foundation world actually take note of and come to grips with the fact that we're in a poly crisis. The foundation world is still going on as if it's business as usual, doing grants, isolated strategies, working autonomously, and the intersecting crises of climate, of public health, of inequality, of violence that are threatening the future of the world. The foundation world goes on as if none of that's happening and just going about doing business as usual. And I think it's not only makes it less effective, but in fact it's dangerous and is part of the problem of continuing to act as if we're not in a global crisis. And the work that needs to happen is dealing genuinely with systems transformation. We're not just talking anymore about just having outcomes of a grant or even a theory of change. Transformation of systems is a very different agenda, and it requires inner organizational networks of foundations if they're going to really make a contribution. And I don't see that happening.
Part of what I'm interested in is what are the conditions under which, whatever the experience that people are offering up, can we discern? Not for replication, because I'm not a scale believer, but to understand what was happening for the human, the humans, the historical context, the possibility, like that larger situational analysis. I'm always really curious about that, because I do believe, at least in my experience, that makes it easier for someone else to ascertain if some of those things are similar or dissimilar, that they might be able to try something. And I think making those things more transparent and explicit would really be helpful to the humans, because it's all humans. There's not systems or policies or practices or orgs or movements. It's all this messy carbon-based life form. And I wish we'd get messier, more comfortable with the mess.
I like your focus on it's all humans. There's an article that I just read about trauma-informed systemic change, and it focuses on the notion that, one, the people in the system, not just those affected by the system, but sometimes also the decision makers, have experienced trauma. The systems themselves behave in ways that really reflect the trauma that people have experienced, and they also drive the trauma. So when I think about what do I want to know more about philanthropy, kind of where could the thought leadership go, I've been grappling with how do we make more visible the harm that we're causing, and not just through grant-making practices, because I feel like we've figured out a lot about how our practice as grant makers in philanthropy causes harm, but I'm actually intrigued, are we paying attention to the harm we're causing in systems? Are we noticing when we are reinforcing one of the really destructive patterns, or when we're trying to layer on a Band-Aid, but we call it a systemic change because we never made space by disrupting something in the system? I think we have done a really good job, and Foundation Review a great job of making systemic change strategies in philanthropy more visible, of building more and more evidence of how it works. But I don't really think we're telling stories about where we caused harm in the system. And I feel pretty confident that with as many systemic change strategies are out there, there's got to be some harm that's happening, and we need to learn from it.
I think this question of harm is so important. And not only can, politics or war or other things do harm, but philanthropy can do harm as well as good. And I think one of the things that Julia said before we were on camera was about the idea of the duty of care that in the journalism field, she was saying they talk about. And it made me think about, what does it mean to be a philanthropy professional? What is the best of professionalism? And professionalism in any good profession, there is a standard of ethics. And the first in the, codes of ethics, do no harm. And so a journal that brings together theory and practice in philanthropy ought to be helping philanthropy professionals and as well as volunteers like board members to think about the ethical practices, ethical implications of their decisions and behaviors. And I think that's what a journal like this should strive toward. I just wanted to shout out one of my favorite articles that's come out of the journal, not represented here in this roundtable, unfortunately, but the late Paul Connolly, who worked at the TCC group for many years, wrote a piece in the journal called "The Best of the Humanistic and Technocratic: Why the Most Effective Work in Philanthropy Requires a Balance." And I constantly point people to that article and that idea, because I think it, as you were saying, Tom, earlier, it gives me, and I think hopefully others, a framework about how do we make decisions, how do we practice philanthropy, and I think it the best kind of article in this journal can help people who are reading understand what they're doing and what is the context and history and sort of conceptual background that they may be using without even being aware of it.
So I appreciated your comment about how hard it is to change the evaluation field, the sense of protection of what's right, the definition of rigor, the definition of what the right way to approach an evaluation is. And the article I'm here for, the article on causal pathways, is one of those challenges because it's asking the question of, instead of being either or, either you do an experimental or quasi-experimental design to prove your intervention, or you just describe it. There's nothing in between. It's asking evaluation to change that. But I actually don't think that the pickup and interest in it was because of that notion of changing the evaluation practice. I feel like the first round, we got so much outreach when it first came out, and Julia Kaufman and I were fielding calls from philanthropic partners who were saying, we need this. We need this information. We are making decisions based on causal ideas all the time. We are stating things. We are creating theories of change. And this is an aha moment of, oh, we're not even testing them. We're just describing the things we saw, but not why those things happened. So I actually think the gap here is that evaluation forgot to change, even as people moved forward. And we're now doing such complex work in philanthropy, and we are making so many assumptions, and we're holding on to them so hard, even when there's kind of vague feedback in the environment telling us we might be wrong. And so I think the other piece is there's this hunger to better understand how systems really change. And there's a lot of systems change strategies that struggle to make sense of the outcomes they're collecting. They have these indicators, they seem really good, but they actually can't find their own work in that. And so they don't have a robust story either to tell their funders if they're on the ground doing the work, or as a funder to tell their leadership and board, because causality isn't clear. So I think there's something really interesting here about, we need to redefine rigor. To your point earlier, the notion that rigor comes from a very problematic place means we need a new way to think about what quality looks like in this work. And we also need to redefine who is driving the questions and who is starting the conversation and who is an expert in the room, and have the methods and the methodologists be the tool that those on the ground are able to use to ask and answer the questions that they care about. A little bit unrelated, but I want to follow up because we have such an interesting theme about this work being all about people, people in philanthropy, people in social change. And I think the other piece that is really important to me is it is absolutely about the humans. It is about all of the ways we are capable of being amazing catalysts and working together. I think it's also about all the constraints that we are surrounded by, the things that shape our behavior, either visibly or less visibly, and doing our best to remove some of those constraints that are getting in the way of offering our full and complete selves to the work. I think philanthropy can create some of those constraints, but is also in a good position to help remove them, or at least make them visible so that we can remove them together.
Thanks. I'll just add my 2 cents around what really energizes me in the work in the field is that, having had the privilege of studying successful networks for so long, I've really been inspired by these unsung heroes who've been the catalysts of bringing together different players, sometimes even former competitors, and working with them on equal footing, being very humble players, working with community and trying to build community as a primary objective of their work, whether they were in nonprofit organizations or in foundations. And really, I think there's an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity for a culture change in social impact work. That's less about individual organizations and their strategies and kind of that traditional linear approach to how do we look to communities to see what their needs are and enable them to build the solutions and equip them with local capacity. In so many communities, there's so much energy and talent and resources already being deployed. My wish is that funders could look to what's already succeeding in communities and put support into those existing successes rather than trying to create new entities or new collaborations that they can label and name just for their own sake, but rather saying, where's the social capital and energy in the communities that's really working and solving problems? How can we enable that? And that's where a lot of this work on networks has been interesting to me, because it's a very bottoms up approach. It's not kind of a prepackaged solution that experts or people with advanced degrees have researched or formulated. In fact, my research really has only emerged because I've been able to study people in the field who've done great work building community amongst fellow human beings. Jara, I loved your way of describing it, of carbon-based beings. It's because it's absolutely true. And I say this network work, sometimes people think it's complicated or it's innovative or it's hard to do, but it really is just human to human connection. It's relationships. And the more you put people who are high integrity, trustworthy, and committed to a shared goal, and then you build relationships amongst them, great things will happen. And it doesn't need to be orchestrated or forced, nor do you need to incentivize it with carrots and sticks. So my hope is that there will be more work in the spirit of how do we change that culture? Because this culture that I'm describing in my work is certainly one that's more human. It's more around community and relationships. And what makes all of us tick is that validation, being part of something greater than ourselves, being part of a community that cares, and mutual support and respect. And I think that's already happening in our world. And I'd love to just continue to shine a light on that. I'd love more people to start thinking about how to do that, and enabling funders in particular, because there's such a powerful force in the social impact space to begin enabling that as well.
I was thinking a little bit about this in the context of course, the article that we wrote on culture. And I think one of the things that we didn't explore much in that article, which I would love to see somebody explore, or maybe it'll be us at some point, I don't know, is about the board's role in a foundation's culture, and how the board can help advance kind of the culture that's going to help that foundation make really significant change, or it can hinder it. And I think there's not a lot of discussion around board culture and how that connects to kind of the staff culture. And then, of course, as our article talks about, how that then connects to the external world. So that's one of the things that I wish there was more conversation about and more written about.
I come at this work from a slightly different angle, which is thinking about the nonprofit sector and nonprofit businesses and what they need to operate and function. And certainly grants are a huge part of that, and philanthropy is an important source of fuel. Government is even a larger source of fuel for the sector. And we're in a lot of conversations with nonprofit executives who are dealing with a business model, working with government that is really challenging, keeping them up at night, worried about cash flow. The contracts that they get from municipal or state government don't pay enough. And even when they're in a payment cycle, payments run late, cash runs tight. Nonprofits are worried about paying rent and keeping the lights on, making payroll. And these have a real cost to, the human dimension of running these organizations, the level of stress that this creates. We spend a lot of time thinking about how, the capital in our accounts, while they're sort of waiting to be deployed as grants, how can they fill gaps and bridge receivables and deal with these timing issues? Because the nonprofits, when they have to finance, they have to go to get a line of credit to finance the timing of the receivables. Very often those contracts don't allow the contract dollars to be spent on interest. So where are they getting the dollars to pay the interest? From their private donors, from philanthropy, from less restrictive types of money. So the way that that government and philanthropy works together is a real kind of interesting area, I think, for future issues of the foundation review to focus. So I think the causal relationships of change in the world may even be beyond the powers of some of the folks on this call who are experts on that. But I can say that we've had a lot of inbound interest about building on some of the case studies that we wrote about in the piece. We had a foundation come to us with $1 million and open a donor-advised fund to capitalize a low-interest revolving loan fund for one of their favorite youth-serving organizations in New York City. And then a corporate foundation is preparing to make $1 million loan to FJC so we can on-lend it to a series of affordable housing developers who would then match fund with some donor capital. And then a couple of our nonprofit borrowers who've borrowed from FJC at a market rate of interest are interested in working with us to create a pooled fund that would serve their whole sector of legal defender organizations at a below market rate of interest. So we are seeing these kind of like green shoots of like practitioners and people who are thinking about this stuff. I think, I do worry sometimes that we're kind of like preaching to the choir to some degree, because the folks who I'd really like to be reading this article are investment committees of foundations and, folks who work on Wall Street and people who have access to way more resources, who might think more creatively about them if they knew what was possible. But one of the kind of interesting lanes I'm trying to open is around working with nonprofit boards that may have some resources around the table and may have some financial sophistication in terms of how they think about money. But if we could, instead of like centering, like what is the donor preference for how philanthropic resources can be put to work? If we could center like what do the nonprofits need? What are their gaps in their business models? And how could nonprofits benefit from building up their balance sheets, not just having grants that help them, operate in the black for the year, but open up, a line of communication about balance sheet equity-like investments in nonprofits that have a longer-term horizon and are building up the financial capacity of the organizations, not just, funding a program or funding, for their annual P&L. So those are the kinds of conversations I'm hoping that this article can help advance.
Not super well formulated, but I do have a question for you, Brandon. So I was not familiar with goal-free evaluation. So I learned something in looking at your article. That was good. I guess my question is, since the racial reckoning in 2020 and the killing of George Floyd, have you seen even greater interest or adoption or openness to goal-free evaluation? Because I was reading your article and just reflecting on and feeling like, as you think about kind of some of the foundation's commitments to equity and inclusion, which is super important to us, how goal-free evaluation could be really aligned with that commitment and those values in a way that maybe more traditional approaches to evaluation haven't been. And so I guess I'm just curious if you've seen a deeper kind of connection there and a greater openness to it.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I do think there is a bit more openness, or at least willingness, to consider it as a potential option. Not that I'm necessarily having my door, banged on every day asking for goal-free evaluations, but I do think there's a lot of interest in it, and whether it's a feasible, reasonable thing to do, in part because when you said DEI, I've had people say, well, can't you just measure our DEI outcomes? I'm like, I don't know, what are you trying to do? And they tend to not. They have really vague, abstract ideas and concepts that they think that I'm just going to be able to magically come up with something that shows that the DEI is improving at their organization or something like that. And so I do think that sometimes this goal-free evaluation can be a great tool for when we just don't know really what outcomes we are trying to find. Yes, we can say, everyone's going to be more inclusive, but okay, what is the outcome that we're looking for actually? How do we measure? And instead, I can kind of go to them and ask them, what outcomes are you seeing? What evidence do you think counts as something that shows that DEI is improving at your organization or in your program? And so I think there's a lot of that. And I also just think it may not be because of like the racial reckoning, as you mentioned, or COVID, but I do think there is just a continued skepticism of goals in general. I think that there was at one time maybe the tide's turning a little bit, that there was a wave of goals, set goals, measure goals. Every evaluation and program, issue will be solved with just good goal setting processes and monitoring. And then I think there's been a pretty reasonable and pushback against that, at least as to not have it be so simplistic, that it's never quite so simple as that. And I do think that's maybe in part because of, because of goal free, but I also think that is just that there are people that are pushing back like against the goals. They tend to find goal free evaluation.
Michael and I were speaking before the call. I was curious about, in my experience, it's so difficult, and I think, Michael, you work at the institutional level so often, and in fact, you were just talking about working across institutions to create transformational change. Thinking about the theory of philanthropy, how it feels to me like it can, in the dynamic tug and pull of philanthropic thinking, that it can be difficult to have anything be sustainable over a period of time. And I'm just wondering, and we were talking about utilization, this is your question. How do you make sure that what have you learned since you wrote that article about having a theory of philanthropy that really expresses what is actually happening over time in a foundation and is sort of a sustainably usable?
It's a great question, and where I've come out on it is that in complexity and systems change, the sustainability is in the values and principles. It's not in the outcomes, the short-term outcomes that get achieved. And goal free is a piece of an example of that. As you get deeply into systems change and understand them, the things that you thought you were directing at and the relationships that you thought were critical end up inevitably changing, both because the inquiry changes that and you realize what's going on in the system in different ways. And part of what evaluation has come to, and I think planning as well in many ways and design, is that it's not so much the actual activities that are sustainable. What we've come to is trying to make sustainable at a cultural level, Amy, the ways of thinking, evaluative thinking, strategic thinking, systems thinking, complexity thinking. That what we're seeing in our world, United States being a prime example, is people aren't thinking. They don't know how to think. They aren't critical thinkers. They don't know how to process information. They don't know how to tell good information from bad information. They don't know how to connect the dots in terms of what's happening, understand what's going on. And so what we need is not being able to do nice, good linear grants that achieves more short-term outcomes, but to get people to think systemically about how the world works and what that means. And the cross-fertilization then of strategic thinking, systems thinking, evaluative thinking is all about making a difference in the world. It's reminding us Hannah Arendt's great analysis of the Holocaust, the banality of evil, was that nobody was thinking about what was going on. Their heads were buried. They didn't want to think about it. We got a lot of that going on, including in philanthropy. So I think the sustainability is in the capacity to make sense of things, engage systemically, not discrete outcomes.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on to what Julia and Jara were talking about as far as who gets to define what quality looks like and how do we evaluate these organizations. I think the biggest response we've had to our piece, the 4 network principles to collaboration success, which is really laying out a very simple framework around the lessons that we saw happening in successful networks across both my and my co-author Nora Silver's work, was that there's a focus on mission before organization, an emphasis on trust rather than top-down controls, an emphasis on humility rather than self-promotion and brand building, and a goal to build constellations rather than stars. And what we've heard from people is that for those with whom this resonates the most is they're saying, oh, thank you for writing this. This is how we've been working for years, if not decades. And we've had to fight tooth and nail to get space and permission to work in this way. I'm so glad you as researchers are validating our approach, because it's about community and relationships. And we know this is what works, but our funders, our board members, some of our partners, they don't get what we're talking about or how we're working, but your research is helping make that space to allow us to do it. Because although the principles are very, very simple, mission, trust, humility, constellations, they are totally counter to most of what philanthropy drives for, which is organization success, brand building, kind of the star organizations, and kind of that top-down control approach. It's so countercultural, but at the same time, when you talk to people who are very close to the problems, they know this is the way to work. And so if anything, our work has really just been a validation of some of those quiet successes that have been flying under the radar that haven't gotten the recognition or the space. And again, I always feel like it's such a privilege to be able to shine a light on this great work. And it's truly been an inspiration for me. That's what gets me going with my work, is how can I help these amazing leaders, these catalysts and their networks thrive, because they shouldn't have to fight this hard. And if I can use my very small platform to help make the case for this is the way forward, I will do everything I possibly can, because I have no doubt this is what I believe in, because I've seen it. It works in the field. It's not my idea. I didn't invent it. I just happen to study what works. And that's what I'm trying to bring, that message to the philanthropic sector that can use that as a force for good.
Well, I've seen the Foundation Review as an opportunity to deepen and amplify what I'm already doing and thinking about and studying. So, we've included the article that I wrote, which was researched by others as well, although I wrote it. And we included in our online toolkit, which people really seem to like. And we've also summarized the essay in 2 short episodes on our podcast. So tried to take what was there and sort of continue to keep it alive in different ways, and include it in a practical set of tools that help people take action. So I think so that's one thing I wanted to say about how we've been able to use the piece. The other thing I just wanted to add on to what Jane was saying about the role of people. And even though my article talks about evaluation data, we've really been trying to build a new way for funders to think about how they make change and to extend backwards from where they often start. So, funders often start by thinking about, results and outcomes. And so that's why they want to evaluate things, to understand what the outcomes are. And there's so much focus on results-based this and outcomes that and the indicators of success. But, going back, in sort of the logic of how you make change, which is not linear, but if you want to use a kind of linear approach to it, you can go back to strategy, program design. You can go back to organizational capacity, which is often where people stop, funders stop, is thinking about organizational capacity. And what we've been arguing is we need to go back one or two more steps. What creates and sustains capacity or strategy is people, which is what we've been talking about on this call, that all of our institutions and systems are made up of people who build and sustain them and compose them. And so, and then how do we get people in the door and to stay and to leave well? We have to invest in people's systems, policies and practices that enable people to have, meaningful work and stay in it even when it's hard. And so that's what we've been talking about with building our kind of framework around talent investing, is that funders need to invest in people and people's systems within organizations and ecosystems so that nonprofit leaders and workers can create capacity, create strategy, create programs that result in outcomes and outputs and outcomes. So really trying to push people to think way back up the chain of events to all the people who are behind all of this work, because it is not, nonprofits are not robots or machines that you put dollars in one end and out comes social change. They are these entities made up of people, and we have to support those people in order to get the change we want to see going. So that's why I think our article, in some small way, gets some visibility and offers people a new way of thinking, or at least a way that is not the generally accepted practice.
Thank you. My question's aimed at Jane. So I feel like a lot of the advice and insights and challenges we're talking about here, they have to do with the practice of funding and the needs of grantee organizations, and kind of how to engage with grantees and how to invest in the people and bring new resources into these organizations. A lot of the decisions that I end up working with Philanthropy on are not quite in that space. They're a step before then. They're about where and to what end they're going to do the funding. What is the strategy? What is the impact they hope those nonprofits will have in the world? So your article felt like it was more moving into that area, that when we have these really successful networks, they're capable of very transformative things. So my question would be, how do you find and or nurture from a philanthropic perspective the high impact networks, and how do you help them sustain the pipeline piece, but also the kind of complexity and competitiveness of resources, all these other things? What's the philanthropic role in that space?
Thank you for that question, Julia. I think one of the key pieces that philanthropies can do is kind of turn the approach that they've traditionally done on its head. So instead of issuing competitive RFPs and saying who can self-promote better than their peers in order to attract our funding, they can go into communities and start talking to people, whether it's nonprofit leaders, church leaders, government leaders, beneficiaries that they're trying to serve. Who has helped you? What organizations, what entities have enabled you to improve your situation or have supported you and given you the skills or the resources, the tools that you needed to move forward? Instead of, again, having people strive for self-promotion and whether or not they truly are that impactful and brag about themselves on these competitive grant proposals. That's one step, is to ask people who are in the know of what's actually working in their communities. And then the other is, again, you'll probably get tired of hearing me say it, is even when you found those types of trusted, high integrity leaders who have a track record for success, then it's asking them, what supports do you need? They may not always just need money. Maybe they need support on finding others of like mind in the community to build a network with, so they can get systemic approaches to addressing the problem, whether it's government leaders and counterparts that are addressing an issue like homelessness or education issues or public health, that there might be not many nonprofits working on that, but then there are relevant public agencies, and maybe a grantee, a nonprofit doesn't have those connections into that community. Maybe a board member in the philanthropy might know somebody, or even bringing those people together. Oftentimes there's fellowship programs that bring kind of cross-sector leaders together, private sector, nonprofit, and government leaders, and bring them together in trust building, relationship building, and creating more connection. And again, community, where people begin to see, oh, we can help each other solve our problems. And that type of training kind of touches on what Rusty's talking about. It's the investment in people is not solely higher salaries, better working conditions, but investing in leaders, little L leaders, because everybody within an organization has an opportunity to make a transformative impact. And they are the ones on the front lines who are closer to the problem, who are better able to judge. So equipping them with the leadership skills, the training, peers, fellowships, and retreats where they can learn some of those skills in a safe place with each other. And at the same time, not feel like they're so vulnerable if they try and experiment with something new, that they're going to be punished because their results or their performance isn't by some funder standard, didn't deliver within the 2-year time horizon or whatever. It's just that ability to experiment, learn, make mistakes, listen, and adapt based on what you're hearing and learning from other peers. That's so extraordinary, powerful, and it's very intuitive. Again, for people who are working in the field in these types of networks, this is just what they do, but they're often swimming upstream and fighting all of these battles just to help their various stakeholders understand, whether it's their boards or their funders or their peers. Because again, that scarcity mindset doesn't have to be there. The scarcity mindset is almost imposed by the philanthropic power that it has. It just drives for competitiveness. Prove what you have done. Don't worry about what your peers have done. In fact, don't sing anybody else's praises. Lift up your own work, because that's how you're going to attract the next tranche of funding. That culture needs to change. And so there's a lot that funders can do, but I think it's modeling a different way of leading and a different way of building up community and the individuals that make up community at all levels to make that difference.
You know, it's interesting. The theme I'm hearing across your comments is to keep your ears close to the ground, to stay connected to, whether it's through culture, through the communities, through the work that's being done, so that you're really responsive. So I have just a quick follow-up question. For foundations that want to be strategic, which I know has kind of become a bad word, actually, strategic philanthropy, what's your advice to them just in terms of addressing these very urgent global crises, poly-global crises that you referenced, Michael? Just curious, your thoughts on that. Is it all responsive, or can they really make a difference in some of these urgent needs that need to be addressed?
I think that moving to a theory of transformation that looks at the ways in which major transformation happens, and we're talking here about things like the end of apartheid, which philanthropy played a role in, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Me Too movement, global efforts to stop smoking, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, these major movements. Nobody's in charge of these things. There are multiple players interacting around some shared values, and that to marshal resources more in an aligned way. So it moves alignment not just from within the foundation, which is where we've much been focused, but looking at aligning across foundations to take on large-scale transformational issues. There's a book that's just come out this week by Gerald Hage, Hage, and colleagues, called Saving Society, Achieving Innovation and Equity Through Interorganizational Networks. And it's about aligning networks. It's about aligning organizations to create sufficient critical mass and tipping points, because no single foundation, even the biggest, have the resources to do that alone. It's in the alignment and the trajectories where things combine to create those tipping points. And it means working across different arenas, people working on regulation, on education, on incentives, on organizational dynamics, on communities, but aligning their work so that it supports each other toward that larger direction. And for foundations collectively to begin to have transformational impact is going to require them to create interorganizational collaborations and not just do their own thing.
So one of the things that I struggle with, and the trauma thing kind of triggered it for me, is I don't actually believe that we get someplace new by focusing on all the things that are not right. So how do we balance? And I don't know that balance is the right word either, but how do we somehow find some harmony between what has been not what we would want and being able to aspire and inspire towards something new? Because we have not ever been here before. This group of people at this moment in time with all the things that are happening. And yes, there are historical and present day efforts to do things that I think will lead to, or already leading to, more harm and more trauma. But I also believe that there are things that are glorious and wondrous and joyful. And so I wonder how we can better tap into the things that give me energy, that inspire me, that make me excited, that make me hopeful and joyful, as opposed to just being so freaking exhausted by a country that was literally founded on harm. So how do we do both? And how might we lean a little bit more towards the world that I hope we can live in, that I want Rusty's girls to be in, right? As opposed to the world in which, like, we all came into.
I go back to Amy's opening comment about the board and the challenges of getting boards to take the time to be engaged and what the board's roles are. I've had a couple of good experiences with boards, but for the most part, I find the biggest challenge as a consultant to work with the boards is that staff don't want you to work with boards because they are especially the CEO, their game is to manage the board. And when they have some loose cannon consultant come in for even 10 minutes, it just scares them to death of breaking down that managing the board. So I'm interested in your experience of how people outside can get access to a board in a way that's positive for everybody involved. One of the reasons why theory of philanthropy work didn't get very far is it requires engagement of all the players. It has to be deep engagement of the board, of senior staff, of junior staff, and of grantees. And there are lots of barriers to doing that because they don't want to be transparent, Marilyn, with each other about what's really going on. So how do you deal with that, Amy? What's your secret to getting to boards?
I don't know if I have the secret, Michael. I will say though, and I'm thinking of an experience in the last couple of years where, I think that it really took building a deep trusting relationship with the CEO, knowing that the CEO felt like they could trust me, that we had each other's backs in working with the board, to be honest, and it took time. But to your point, CEOs feel like they have a lot to gain and lose depending on what happens with their board and who they bring in to talk to their board. And so I do feel like, it sounds so simplistic, but it's like at the end of the day, like building the deep, trusting relationship with the leadership. And in some cases that may never transpire, right? And I've had that too, where that just doesn't happen and it doesn't transpire. But where it's been successful, I feel like probably why is because I invested a lot in building that relationship and that trusting relationship and helping that leader know that, like I said, that I was going to have their back and and hold in confidence things that they may have said to me that, were about their board, about issues with the board, et cetera. So I don't know. It sounds really simplistic though, Michael. I don't have the magic answer. I just want to be clear about that.
Thank you to all of the panelists for their incredible insights. The journal's mission is to share evaluation results, tools, and knowledge about the philanthropic sector to improve grant-making practice to support them for greater impact. The Author Roundtable and the special 15th anniversary issues provide an opportunity at this point for us to think about and reflect upon the strengths of the journal and where we still need to go. You heard in the Author Roundtable 4 really key cross-cutting themes. First, foundations need better strategy and more capacity, more collaboration to address the polycrises of today and tomorrow. Foundations are not adapting quickly enough within the context of a rapidly changing world. Second, foundations need to engage in authentic and effective networking and organizing practices in order to advance change. Foundations can promote the idea of collaboration and align action, but rarely engage in the same within their own foundation roles. Third, at the heart of all the change and transformation that philanthropy is trying to achieve are people, the human capital part of our theory of change and impact. We are not investing enough in people who need to learn and lean into riskier change needed to advance and achieve impact. Fourth, foundations should better leverage and engage in the financial investments and market capacities and forces that could support change, especially long-term and sustainable finance for nonprofits and change organizations. I would like to close by thanking everyone again for participating. I would like to give profound thanks also to Teresa Behrens, the founding editor-in-chief. She has done a remarkable job over the last 15 years creating a knowledge-to-action resource for the field of philanthropy and beyond. We wish her a happy retirement. I would also like to thank Pat Robinson, Associate Editor, as well as Leslie Slavitt, the new Executive Director of the Johnson Center. She's been such a supportive advocate of the journal. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our generous funders, without whom so many things would not have been possible this year. The 2 special combined issues, making the articles open access, and the newly established Ricardo Millett Fund to bring fresh new voices and perspectives into the journal. Our funders are the Walton Family Foundation, the Duke Endowment, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Margaret A. Cargill Foundation Fund for the Minneapolis Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Once again, thank you to all the panelists, our many reviewers, as well as our readers.